welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here. Today, hopefully you guys are already aware, we're going to be talking about some drive control mounting. I'm going to try and keep it more to the standard mounting options we have. We'll get into a little bit of custom, but more or less we'll be talking drive control, mounting, and access. But first off, a couple of housekeeping things. We are recording this webinar. We're going to make it available as soon as we can, so keep an eye out on our YouTube page, our website, and we'll get that posted, that recording of today posted as quickly as we can. If you have any questions or anything, please drop them into the Q&A or the chat, either one. We'll do our very best to get that answered while we're all on this call, but if there is anything that we can't answer on the call, we'll make sure to follow up as soon as we can and get that answer to you. All of the slides are going to be shared as well. So once we wrap up, I will share some, or I will email everyone. We'll use the email that you use to register for the webinar. We'll provide a copy of all of the slides, but there will also be a link to a quiz for CEC credit and things like that. So last thing though is if you are new to Teams webinars, we do have an international audience here. So if you prefer, you can translate the slides. It'll translate most of the text on the slides. So they're at the top of the window there, you have a more, a set of ellipses. You can click those and there's a translate slides option. So you can choose several different languages to translate in if English is not your first language. So with that, we'll jump in. Today, again, more or less what I'm going to do is just give you a rundown of a lot of our drive control mounting options, give you some of the highlights and features of them and pros and cons of each. And then we'll go through some examples of some of the less typical setups. So we'll start with a little bit of a discussion on considerations though. So when we're choosing alternative drive controls, it's pretty essential to make our choices according to that client's needs, their capabilities, things like that for a successful result. And that means we need to look at options that could easily be tailored to specific individuals and their requirements, right? And so that's all pretty well given for drive controls itself, but today we're going to look at it in that same line of thought for the mounting hardware on that particular drive control. So we'll start with some general considerations for just alternative drives in general here. Before we move on into the actual drive controls, I do want to take a minute to look at this quote by Lang and Meikle. It's a pretty important quote in my opinion. Right, so the best programming, driver control selection, and mounting in the latest software upgrades for power mobility control cannot substitute for incorrect seating and positioning, right? And that seating, that statement really highlights an underlying truth in the power mobility world, right? And no matter how advanced our technology is, right, programming, the mounting, the control options, we will not find a desired outcome if that client's not properly seated in position, right? It's essential for the long-term success and ongoing assessment and drive control utilization. So seating is critical, right? I hope that's a given for everyone. And so following that quote, the general rules here should not be news to anyone on this webinar, right? We need to find that client's best, most functional position, and that should always start with a well-positioned pelvis. And then we remember our old rules here, right? Stabilize proximally to promote distal function. So to do that, and we do that while we provide hopefully the minimal amount of support that gets the job done. We can absolutely overcorrect and eliminate that client's function by trying too hard to correct a thing, right? Sometimes we might try to control some compensatory strategies, and that extra control might eliminate their ability to use that drive control. So we have to be careful to not go overboard. But In general, if our client's sitting different every time they're in the chair or they're not stable while they operate the chair, success with any drive control is going to be very, very hard to come by, right? If they're not well positioned, maybe they migrate through the day. It's going to be very, very difficult to have them operating that drive control in a consistent manner, accessing it in consistent manner. So success is difficult. Now, when we do look at any given drive control, there's a few things at our disposal to help us promote function for the client. It can be as simple as just changing the joystick handle or topper for a different shape, right, to fit that client. If that client maybe lacks a little bit of that pincer grasping, but otherwise has good hand strength and mobility, simply moving them to a ball or say a U-shaped topper would mean they can stay at a more efficient joystick for longer. So simple changes make a big difference there. And these days there's programming inside of almost every drive control itself on top of what the chair has. Um, and that can really help us be much, much more successful. If I have a great forward throw physically, but my left and right is kind of a struggle, I might be able to just reduce the programmed throw requirement so that that client reaches that full turn with a lot less movement from the joystick, right? And the third thing here that we're focused on today is going to be the mounting, right? And the choice of mounting solution for any alternative drive control is pretty critical for achieving successful outcome. We've got to consider things like, does that need to swing away? Does it need to be removable? Is a fixed mounting solution required to meet that client's needs and goals? And so for every given access site that we might have in drive control, we've got to think about a lot of things, but it may just be as simple as rotating the joystick a little bit, right? If my client has great function, but they tend to naturally move their forward command in more of like an 11 o'clock position, I can just rotate the joystick a little bit and find success, right? So we need to look at some of these options today that can reach some fairly complex positions with a lot of adjustability, but I don't want us to lose sight of how simple things like just turning a joystick can make the world of difference for that client, right? So I'll get pretty heavy into some complex things, but don't discount the simple steps too. Now, when we talk about access sites, we have a few traditional points. We usually start at the hand. It's the most natural, intuitive access site, and to drastically oversimplify it, our hands are what we naturally use to manipulate objects in our world, so they tend to make for a natural starting point for manipulating that drive control, right? So at the hand, we might be looking at a mounting for a standard or a lighter throw joystick, heavy duty joysticks, things like that. We might need to mount more midline for easier access. It might need to swing away for ADLs. We might need height adjustment so that that client can rest their arm and their hand in the correct position for the joystick. Sometimes we need all of that in one option. So we don't forget that um, using the drive control might involve some utilization of the upper extremity. But if we tilt back in our power chair or go over a bump, some clients can lose access to it. So that could also involve things like added positioning components like an elbow block or custom trays or lateral supports for the forearm. So all of that can help to bring more success to that drive control, right? So we want to eliminate the inconsistencies that that client can experience through all of the movements of that chair. When we move into fingertip, right? So when a client lacks the function or endurance in the whole hand, we can maybe possibly move to a finger. And when we look at using the finger for drive control access, that could be an ultralight joystick, switches, sensors, things like that. But if we have a client, for example, maybe with multiple sclerosis, right? We may also need a way to keep that digit warm so that they don't lose function. And like before, we may need arm troughs, we may need elbow supports in addition to something to position that drive control itself. We need to maintain the hand position and control of that arm so that they have access to that drive control. There can be challenges with our initial go-to sites, right, in the upper extremities and things that force us to look into other options if we get to thinking of head and chin movement. We also have to look at what effective and efficient movement there and in that location looks like for that user, right? And how do we pair that with the options we have available? So of course, most importantly, we have to meet our clients' needs where they're at, consider their preference, right? So there's a few hardwares that we're about to get into to get that drive control in that correct position. From a manual swing away on the head support to a harness that more or less mounts to the user. All of them, you've got a bunch of different degrees of independence and stuff like that, and we're about to go through those. But I wanted to point out, right, we're trying to look at effective and efficient movements. And I'm kind of hanging on this subject for chin control, but the rule applies on every body part, right? So on chin control, it's a little easier to highlight. So when we're talking about chin control, we have all these hardwares that more or less get the joystick in the same place. But if I come in from the front of the chin with that chin control joystick, right, more or less having the joystick itself horizontal, I'm using like an up and a down of my chin, right, more or less a head nod to drive forward and reverse. But that same hardware can put that joystick in more of a vertical position from below the chin, and that means forward and reverse are more of a protraction, retraction of the chin and the head. And so that little tiny difference in movement and orientation is going to make a enormous impact on how that exact same drive control is operated by the user. So that's where finding where they're good and consistent and what their good movement looks like is getting pretty important, right? But we do often on the chin control get feedback that not wanting something in your face at all times is kind of unwanted, right? And I can completely understand that, especially if they don't have means to move that out of the way on their own. It can be problematic in a lot of scenarios. So let's say we've ruled out the upper extremities, we've ruled out head, or sorry, chin. We move to the head, right? We just want to explore more options for our client and choose what they prefer. Usually that's going to put us in the head control. And there's definitely crossover and potential users here to some extent, but from a hardware perspective, many of the considerations for a head control, for driver control, are very, very similar to head positioning, right? You'll have the same fixed or flip down options, all that stuff. We need to consider, though, how those side pads attach, how those drive controls attach to the head, right? Do you need simplicity, or are you looking for something that can be super duper adjustable, move out of the way, things like that? And so I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on head control mounting specifically today, um, mainly because it's just extremely similar to last month's webinar topic. So most of that stuff would be exactly the same. And for the group here that's been with us for every webinar, I don't want to put you through half an hour of the same thing you listened to last month, right? So clients who have issues with function in, say, the upper extremities, chin, head, but maybe who still have relatively good foot control could benefit from a foot operated drive control. So there's drive control options that let you drive with knee extension or flexion for forward and reverse. You have the option for forward and reverse by, say, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the foot. And so that's going to change how it mounts a little bit. But sometimes, though, the foot control is challenging because you don't have the same visual feedback of that movement while driving that drive control. The most common issue here, I think everybody will know, is just seat to floor height, right? And that drive control sits below the foot. So you reduce the ground clearance underneath that driving foot. But this site shouldn't be cast aside if there's potential for operating the chair there. So Many of our hardwares that we're going to look at in just a minute here can reach down to the foot, but you can still mount to the foot plate and so on. So from a hardware perspective, there's a lot of possible solutions to choose from. And again, seat to floor height, leg rest articulation, transfers, all of that we've got to think about when we choose the correct position there, or option there. So there are options is the thing I really want to talk about here. So last thing, or second to last thing, from there we might start looking at other body parts, which might allow for controlled driving. So we may be looking at sensors on the knees or the elbows, shoulder switches, a combination of all the above, right? So you may be tempted here to think that from a hardware perspective, requirements might start becoming more complicated, but that's really not the case. Hopefully, as we go through, you'll see that we have the ability to use something like, say, a knee adductor or thigh support hardware as a switch mount. A lot of the hardwares we're about to talk about can be used down in these oddball positions, and say we can use some of our chin control mounting hardware to place a switch at or sensor at the shoulder. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things become more complicated, right? I don't want to see us overwhelmed with the idea of, just because I need to put switches and sensors all over this individual, suddenly my hardware becomes extremely complicated. And that's just not necessarily the case. And then finally, when we have ruled out all of those other options, we end up with the eyes or the tongue, right? Because those may still have good range of motion and precision. But now we do not have an eye gaze driving system or a true like tongue control system here at Stealth. But we can move some of our smaller joysticks, especially like the Movis Micro, to be controlled with the lips and the tongue. So again, the same hardware for the chin, but just a little bit different placement. So there's a lot of, again, hopefully you notice there's a lot of things we have to choose from, right? So as with any equipment choice, there are always a lot of factors to weigh. We're going to have to consider what compromises we're willing to make as we go through that. But I think in my opinion, by understanding some of the key features, some of the advantages with different hardwares, various access sites, really guides you into what options best align with that client's lifestyle, the way they use it in their system. It just becomes a little easier to see how they could use a hardware, and it's definitely easier to see how that hardware might be functional in a more, we'll say, atypical manner, right? And so with all of that now, let's actually look at some options here, right? That's what we came for. So at Stealth, I think if you joined us way back in January for the first webinar in this series, you'll probably remember that Stealth, we as a company cut our teeth in the industry as a hardware solution company. So that being said, we've got a lot of options for drive control mounting, and a lot of these options we can get more creative than what I'm able to show in this webinar today, right? We just don't have the time to get all the way into that. So if there's something you want and you don't see here, you can always ask, right? And so we have mounts that come off the head for chin control or mouth driving, tongue driving, things like that come off the head support. We have mounts that come off of the shoulder area, right, of the chair, again, for chin or mouth driving typically. We have mounts that would attach to the user and not the chair. So wherever the user goes, the mount stays with them. We have mounts that come off the armrest typically. We have several of these, and these can be just as easily mounted off of the seat rail and position the drive control at the hands or even all the way down to the foot. So these are we sell them as armrest mounted drive controls, but we can put them in other places for sure. We have the Eclipse tray, we have palm trays that can serve as mounting points for the drive control. So a lot of options to look at. And so to try and keep things a little more simple, rather than just blasting you guys with every single option we have, I'm going to try to walk through as product family. So each style of mounting. And so we'll kind of walk through that way instead, and hopefully that gets us through it and not overwhelming, right? So first we're going to look at the options that we carry for mounting alt drives at the hand. So keep in mind that many of these could be used to put the joystick, again, at the feet. We can mount off the seat rails and things like that, not just solely at the hands. But let's jump in here. So starting off with the ARMS 260 family, this is a mounting hardware or system which is attached under the armrest traditionally, and it swings away about 110 degrees and always locks back into a home or functional position, right? And often the client can operate that that swing away with a single hand. It can give a ton of adjustability for the installer, and you've got that adjustability in multiple planes. So this is the same kind of system you'll see on some of our knee adductors and elbow supports and things like that. Now, this system does provide a ton of adjustability, but where it does start to struggle is with some of the heavier joysticks. When that rod is adjusted to be pretty far from the ear, right? So we'll call this the ear right here. So when this rod is adjusted really far out, and there's a lot of weight to that joystick, that's kind of where this mount would begin to struggle a little bit. The rod is sprung steel, so it can start to move and stretch a bit if there's a lot of weight on the end of the long rod, for example. And so we want to see this tucked in as tight as it can be for any given application. We always like to see that this excess material gets trimmed down as well so that it can fully flip away and it's not like drawing lines in people's drywall and things like that. And so we don't want to see that cause problems. But when it comes to a simple, like lightweight mounting that also has an incredible amount of adjustability capability in it, this is a very, very capable option, and we can do quite a bit with it. So our ARMS 260 series is compatible with a lot of joysticks on the market from Stealth and Movis. It works with basically all of the joysticks we sell except for our heavy duty joystick that we sell from Movis. So we have options for OEM joysticks from Quantum, some from Arnet as well. We carry options for displays like the enhanced display or Omni 2, even though we're talking about drive control access today, we do have options here to mount a small tablet or cell phone holder. So we can even mount switches, like a variety of mechanical switches and sensors off this same series. So we can do quite a bit and put a lot of things on this ARMS 260. And this will let us put it in some really tight spaces that other hardwares could struggle to get into. Now the Gatlin is just a robust midline mount we've got options for a pretty extensive range of things to mount to it. There's vertical, there's horizontal applications, each with multiple adjustment points. But due to its relatively simple but like really stout design, the Gatlin makes for a very, very durable mounting hardware. We have a pretty wide range of options here. That means you could build the system specific to each user's needs, right? So when we talk about Gatlin, we always want to answer the question, why would I even use a midline mount anyway? So again, for time reasons, I'm going to keep this very, very short. We could spend a lot longer on this answer here, but there's evidence to support that midline mounting for a driver control can help really facilitate and improve posture and control of that power chair, right? The midline drivers tend to sit more upright because they're not reaching and leaning towards the driver control that's, say, hanging off an armrest. And midline mounting tends to line up that drive control with the field of vision, so it feels more intuitive for new drivers to operate a chair with a midline mounted drive control. From a standpoint of protecting the joystick, I should say, it also helps protect that driver control itself from damage because it's not hanging off the side of an armrest. So there's plenty of evidence to support mounting midline, especially early on when somebody's learning to drive their chair and learning to move around in their environment on their own. So um, the Gatlin really excels at that, right? And so there's three distinct series of Gatlin. We've got the Gatlin 400, which is an 8-position locking mount. You've got the Gat 405, which is a 3-position. They're held in place by gravity, so it doesn't actually lock. And then the 406 there on the end is mainly used for chin control mounting, so we're going to skip over that for just a minute. But the Gatlin 400, you've got a barrel. This is the barrel section of the Gatlin. So you've got a barrel there that the top fits into a receiver basically, and it's spring loaded, and you've got a shape cut in there that gives it 8 positions that it can lock away in. So it's simple and easy to use. It really does a good job at preventing unintentional swingaways, right? It's very difficult to accidentally move this out of the way. But operating is pretty simple. You just pull that top or the arm forward away from that barrel, and you can rotate it to the position you want and let it go. It'll retract into that barrel. It'll lock in place. Simple as that. But we do know that some users find that pretty difficult to push forward and swing away. Sometimes it's difficult enough to the point often that you have to have a caregiver or somebody come along and do it. And that's where the next Gatlin comes in, right? When that's just not functional for the person, the Gat 405 uses a different barrel that gives that user 3 positions. It'll just swing from one position, like an in-use home position, to a swung away position that's out of the way. It's extremely easy. Gravity is just what we use to hold it in place there, right? That swing away position can either be 180 degrees or 95 degrees. So just enough that when you fully flip it up out of the way at 95 degrees, it's going to rest in an opened position because it's just a little past vertical. So you just lift up on the end of it. It'll push it out of the way and get out of the way, and there's no need to push forward or flip away or anything like that. Changing between that 180 or 95 degree swing away is a pretty simple process for a technician. I do want to make it clear that it's not something a client can swap back and forth between out in the field very easily. It does take tools, and you got to take some stuff apart and rotate it and lock it back together. But it is a simple process for a technician to get through. Ourselves, we provide a very extensive range of joystick mounts for the Gatlin. In general, these are going to consist of a standard style model that can be slid along that Gatlin arm and then rotate around it as well, right? That silver arm. We also have upgraded versions of most of those that would also include a mechanism for allowing 360 degrees of added rotation at the base of the joystick. We offer options that are compatible with most OEM joysticks from QLogic on the RNet, CJSM. We've got older joysticks from the InCare side, and so our selection also includes mounts for every joystick we sell through Stealth. Some of those are also compatible with the HMC joysticks. We've got several ASL mounts. So if you need to attach a joystick to a Gatlin, there's a very strong likelihood that we'll have a solution to meet your needs, is where this is getting at. We can mount several mechanical switches or sensors as well, and we can mount displays. And the nice thing here is often we need a joystick with switches and maybe even a display, all in the same general area, right? And so the Gatlin, we usually have the real estate to do that if needed, which we can't necessarily always say on other hardware series. So then we also have some options here to mount alternative joysticks and trays. And so the Eclipse tray lets the user rest their arm across that tray and operate that joystick. The Palm tray lets the user rest their palm and wrist on the tray. And then the placement of that joystick in both is height adjustable. Sometimes, depending on the tray we select, there's also some lateral adjustability to that joystick as well, so that the top of the joystick can be placed exactly where the client needs, right? They don't have to reach for it. It's just there. And what all this means, though, is it helps them focus solely on operating the joystick. They don't need to focus on stabilizing their arm or upper extremity or anything while operating that joystick. You just rest that arm, and now I can control the joystick with nothing else but my hand, right? So if I only have gross motor patterns, that does take out some of the complications of drive controls. If I only have fine motor patterns, I'm not focused on stabilizing my arm, right? So it really does help ease some of the demand on that driver. Now, next one up, we do have one Unilink joystick mount right now, and it's for the QLogic 3X and 3E joysticks. But Unilink here, it does give you a pretty remarkable degree of versatility. You can move that joystick to virtually any position you need. So getting it right where the client needs it is almost always achievable with this hardware. You have multiple adjustment options. You've got a depth, height, lateral offset, joystick rotation, joystick tilt. The flip away mechanism can be made to drop straight down or to the side. So whatever is best for this client to use this system, you should be able to do. But more so, we only have this one style, right? But there's endless ways to build off of this and kind of customize the assembly to meet the needs of that user. We've swapped the like adapter plate at the end of the joystick, some parts like that to mount some other alternative joysticks off this assembly and things like that. So you can really get creative here. And now keep in mind that Unilink, it's such a versatile hardware that you can make the thing that you might need but otherwise doesn't exist. So it's as easy as taking an existing assembly. Here in just a minute, we'll look at where someone has taken an elbow support and mounted a joystick. So you can take that assembly, add or remove parts to modify it to say mount a drive control in unconventional or difficult position. So the key to that is that just everything in Unilink is compatible with each other. There's very, very, very few exceptions to that, and so to some extent, your creativity here is kind of the limit. So it's like having a grown-up erector set for specifically mounting things to wheelchairs. So it's pretty fun to play with if you have access to all the parts and pieces. So a quick example here is an all-around joystick that we were able to move to the inside of an arm pad with very minimal mounting hardware, right? It's not made to reach very far or anything like that, but in most cases, a traditional mounting hardware might struggle to hit that position, right? You'll notice that the joystick is also at a slight angle. It's also something that Unilink can do very easily that other hardware sometimes struggle with, right? Often you can rotate in the receiver on the armrest, change that angle some, but that also then means major changes to the height of the joystick, not just the angle. So creativity here, like I said, is kind of the limit. Here we've used that same hardware, Unilink, I should say hardware. We've used a medial thigh support and swapped out the what would traditionally be a pad mounting plate for one that would allow us to attach a Movis joystick. So now you get a midline mounted joystick with flip down, and you've got a bunch of height and depth and angle adjustability for placement of that joystick. So you've got, again, it almost endless ways you can play with this and get creative. I'm gonna have a shameless plug here real fast. So here in a week or two, a couple of weeks actually, we'll also be hosting a webinar at Mobility Management that really takes this idea and topic that we're talking about at the moment, and we're going to focus on that for the whole webinar. So we'll really dive deep into some of the creative things you can do with Unilink. So if you're more interested in that, definitely join that webinar, and we'll have more in-depth discussions on that at that one. So now all of these that we've looked at so far attach from an arm support, right? Over here, these options are relatively, these fixed options here, I should say, are relatively tight to the armrest. We have adjustable as well that'll let you move that drive control lower so that the user can, again, rest that whole arm on the arm support and only focus on operating the joystick rather than stabilizing their upper extremity at the same time. Both those styles, they come in either a tube clamp style or a track mount style. And that's going to work on pretty much all of the OEM style armrests that you'll see on power chairs these days. It can also work on seat tracks if you do the track style mount. You can put it on a seat track very, very easily and get that joystick lower, down to the foot, things like that. The clamp style is also great for arm trough adapters when you do find a tube-based arm support, things like that. But you also here, if you'll notice the 240 style, this shorter style, it does not allow for any adjustability. So once everything's locked in place, it takes tools to move the position of that that drive control. So if you use one of those to mount a Gatlin to an armrest, the Gatlin is always in that position, for example. Where the 250 style, it uses a big ratchet lever to allow for some tool-free adjustment or even removability of that drive control hardware, right? So most of these options we've talked about, like mounting hardware options we've talked about, you'll find they come with the 240 styles, so these fixed ones, but you can swap that out as needed for the height adjustable with ratchet lever. Now we're going to pivot and jump up to the chin now. We have several options here as well. Remember the slides from earlier. To start with, we just talked a lot about Gatlin. There are 3 distinct series, right? But the GAT 400 and 405 that we have, that we just covered, are four arms typically. Now the GAT 406 is our option for chin control mounting. This one is essentially a Gatlin 400 that gets turned vertical, right? This is that 8-position mounted or 8-position barrel. Now this version also uses an 18 by 18 arm, and what that means is this silver rod is 18 inches long in this direction, 18 inches long in the other direction. We also want to trim this down and everything as needed once it's found in its final fitment, but this operates just like the Gatlin 400, only this time instead of pushing straight out, you'd have to pull straight up in order to swing it out of the way. Now this is a rock solid chin control mount, so it's great when you don't want that joystick body to move at all. However, there are a couple of things that could make this one a little difficult for some clients. The first is that swing away method. Having to pick it up and swing it out of the way pretty much always means that client is likely to need a caregiver to move it out of the way for them. The second is that chin control on the Gatlin in this way, it attaches to the chair, right? Either to the center spine or an upright cane, things like that. So that chair has power recline. What that's going to mean is that accessing the joystick becomes more and more difficult as the client reclines backwards. The joystick will have a tendency to migrate upwards in relation to that user's chin with the more recline you introduce. Now, shear reduction mechanisms these days are pretty good, but that is still a problem. Like, there will still be a point where that joystick begins to migrate a little bit. So that can become problematic for users who use full recline on their chair. Now the SM600 series is what I knew of as a stealth chin control mount prior to working for stealth. And so we see this quite a bit as a pretty popular option, but it's going to attach to the head support system. And this will make a very, very simple and very clean chin control mount. It doesn't require much in the way of like physical hardware and attaching hardware and things like that. And so you don't need extra real estate for mounting all that hardware. It's very lightweight. It's simple to adjust and operate. But since it attaches at the head support, you have that same sort of drawback you might get with a Gatlin as a chin mount, right? As you go into tilt, into recline, you'll see that it might tend to start sliding upwards in relation to the user's chin, but you'll also still need to tend it to open and move that out of the way. But we do have attaching hardware for um, 11 different styles of joysticks here. So there's a good chance that if it's chin control joystick, we have a mount for it. Now, the Multi-Swing 2G is a power chin boom from Movis. This has got a pretty compact motor. The arm is adjustable so that it could be a right or left side swing away, and you can really get that joystick right in where it needs to be now. Cables are routed through the arm, so cable management is a lot cleaner and easier. The amount of swing, the direction of swing, how hard, how fast it swings, it's all adjustable. Unlike other like power swing away systems that I've seen out in the world, this one comes to a soft stop and you can have it swing away with a momentary command or with a couple of versions of latched or timed commands. So there is a ton of configurability to this. One of the interesting things, though, is that this has the ability to output switch commands. So what that means is that with one single switch, the client, right, the client can open and close this multi-swing, but they can also issue power and mode commands to the chair. So we can really reduce the required number of switches and access sites for those switches for a client using a chin control. The trick to that, though, is this needs to ideally be a switch that they can access in both the home and swing away positions. So you're not necessarily looking at attaching to that boom that's moving, so that access site can be pretty tough to find sometimes. But when you have it, this mount gives them a lot of independence that they might not otherwise get. Now, the manual swing is also a chin mounting system from Movis, but much like the multi-swing, um, you're using the same arm, so the cabling runs through that adjustable arm, and it's going to attach to an upright cane on the back of the chair or vertical and horizontal tracks on the back side of the chair, things like that. So both multi and manual swings attach the same way, and it can be both of them can be made to swing out vertically or horizontally overhead. But like its name said, the action here is all manual. So to swing out of the way, if they're in chin control, then that does mean an attendant is likely going to be needed to come along and loosen that ratchet lever you have right here so that this thing can swing out of the way. Now, the Movis chin control harness that we're looking at here, we can install our all-around light, micro, multi joysticks, and this is going to provide the client with access to the joystick at their chin. The mounting hardware is very adjustable, so that the joystick can come into that chin at whatever angle we need. We talked about that earlier. But the hardware also has a quick release from the harness, sorry, so that it can be removed for transfers and ADLs, right? So the harness can come off the client and dropped in the floor, and you can safely mount that joystick to the chair and not have fear of it getting stepped on or something, right? Um, but it can quickly be removed for transfers, for ADLs, things like that. The harness is a one size fits most kind of situation right now. So you would bend the shoulder area, right? So you just bend this area to um, lift that joystick into a smaller client. And we can add twister switches with all of our joysticks so that the client can have easy access to, say, a mode or a power switch. But the great thing with this setup, though, is that it attaches to the client and not the chair. So we don't care what's going on with the chair. We don't need the space. We don't need the real estate or mounting location on the chair. But the chair, but the client doesn't necessarily need to be in the chair exactly the same every single time. If they drift from one side to the other or throughout the day, for example, the joystick goes with them. If they go into recline, it stays in the ideal position because it's on the client, not the chair, right? So this is a great way to make sure they always have that access to that drive control regardless of their position or the chair's position. Now we also have our own harness at Stealth. This one does have a bit of a different style to it, but it's the same idea. So it attaches to the client, not the chair. This one has a horizontal bar now for the height adjustment. And we have all of these adjustable links here, which are on a quick release swivel. So that lets you put the Stealth PMPJ, the Movis Micro, or the Multi right in the spot and angle for the client that you need. We can get switches and things mounted on here as well. And that horizontal bar snaps on and off the harness easily, so you can remove it. Now, the one thing to note here is that even though we do pad the top of this thing, the back of the neck is not always a great weight-bearing surface, right? You might have clients that their back support contacts the same area that this might want to fall. If we have clients that are a little more sensitive to contact in that area, they're super bony, things like that, we kind of tend to lean more towards the Movis harness. But the IDCH here is more adjustable than the Movis harness. So there's a lot of crossover in which client's good for which one, but it isn't always, IDCH isn't always the right one. The Movis one maybe doesn't always have the same adjustability you might need. So that's kind of your differentiator. Now, these are both harnesses for chin control, but for our clients that have, say, contracted upper extremities or um, things that mean their joystick needs to be more or less pretty close to the shoulder to drive, right? This makes for a very interesting option. So rather than having to rig something up that comes off the armrest, kind of becomes a little bit more complicated, you could use these harnesses to send the joystick off to the side first and get to that access point for the client with a lot less going on. And again, it moves with them. So those clients are still going to migrate in their seating throughout the day. They're still going to shift and things like that, and it still keeps that joystick with them now. So it works extremely well for that kind of a setup. Now, there are a lot of options, right? And we're really not even getting into much about how we can customize other things to mount drive controls up. So before I close out, I did want to show a few examples of some of these systems in action, but I want to try and make sure that these are a little bit less common setups here. So hopefully these are interesting to you, and can kind of show you some of the things that can be done here. So here we have a middling-ish mounted all-around light joystick, but the tray's added so that the client can stabilize while operating that joystick. You can see that we've customized it and recessed that joystick so that no matter what angle he comes into that joystick at, he should have support for that upper extremity. And when you look at the hand position in the picture on the right there, you can see that's pretty critical for this guy. Now, our next one here, we have an example of a GAP 406. So this is a pretty straightforward setup, actually. He's using an all-around light, an all-around here, but it's got the topper off of a Q-Logic hand control. So remember, though, the caregiver would need to come and pick this up to swing out of the way for his transfers and things, but for him, it holds up pretty well for him if he goes into extensor tone and things like that, maybe bumps that joystick a little bit. So it's working very well for him, even though this is a more or less really straightforward mounting scenario. Now, I know this is kind of tough to see. Let me see if I can zoom in for you guys here. Do this. So here we have this is a customized Unilink mount, but in action here. So you can see that it comes up from kind of the middle of the arm pad and just sits right where she needs it. I think she'll turn here in a minute and get a little better view of it. But again, this is one of those examples of we took Unilink, we were able to build out a thing that worked great for her that's not really a standard option that you'll find on order forms and things. So it works great, and we were able to build that thing she needed. Now here's an example of a palm tray on an ARMS 260 style hardware. Now they do have the tray mounted sideways in this case because of his hand position. So it still gives him that spot to rest. He's not having to focus on stabilizing the arm as much. Here we go, there we go. To drive. So the tray also has hardware that allows for height adjustment of the joystick. So you can have it come through at the right position for him. And in his case, that tray should have a track that would normally allow for side to side adjustment, but in his case, it would be front to back adjustment of the joystick. So again, you can really finitely place that thing where he needs it. And then real fast here, our last one, we have a system where we've, whoops, it's supposed to have been muted, where we have an individual driving with switches on the knee adductors. So this is actually knee adductor hardware that's very, very, very similar to our ARMS 260 family. And he's driving the chair with his knees. So this gives us a ton of flexibility where we can now place those switches where we want, how we want, at the angle we want, but it all flips out of the way for transfers and things like that. So it makes for a very, very simple and clean drive control. So the same approach here, he's driving with pads on the, or sorry, switches on the outside of his knees. We can do that in the inside as well and do it on a medial thigh support. And so again, we can get very creative. I only covered the standard mounting control options today, but I wanted to throw this one in so I could talk about like we are able to use things a little bit outside of their standard normal function to mount drive controls and switches and provide access where traditionally it would be extremely difficult, right? So with that, before I open the floor to questions, I will be sending a PDF copy of this presentation to everyone who joined us. I'll use the email again that you used to register. So that email is also going to have a link for a quiz for anybody who needs CECs. And then just a general survey about today's experience, right? I want to make sure it's good time for you guys. I don't want to waste anybody's time. So that survey is pretty important that for me anyway, to make sure I'm not wasting your time. If there's a way we can improve it, let me know, right? We'll make sure the recording here is available on demand. It'll be on our YouTube page and website as soon as we can get it wrapped up, hopefully within a week or so. But other than that, I will open the floor to questions. And the first thing I wanted to respond to here is, yes, I will definitely get you the part number for the palm tray. There are a few of them, but I'll get those part numbers out. Otherwise, if you guys have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A, and I'll hang out here for a few more minutes and answer anything that comes in. Otherwise, I do appreciate everybody's time today, and if you don't have any questions, that's it for me.